He'd been staring at that patch of mud for almost a full minute before he let himself believe what he was seeing. Because 3 days earlier, that exact spot had been under 6 feet of water. Water nobody in the village had touched in 40 years. Water they told him, flat out to his face, to leave alone. You'll bring nothing up out of that pond but bad luck. Old Ray Doggett had warned him, right outside the corner shop, loud enough for half the street to hear. Marlowe Fenn smiled, said nothing, and went home to start the pump anyway. He had no idea that within a week, that decision would turn him into the most talked-about man in 3 villages, and turn 62 acres nobody wanted into the one piece of land everybody suddenly did. Here's what happened. Marlowe had inherited the farm just 11 weeks earlier, when his grandfather Walter passed, and left him land the rest of the family had already written off. Heavy clay that grew nothing but thistle, and a murky, reed-choked pond the locals called the Black Eye. Nobody fished it. Nobody swam in it. People just walked past it and looked away. The way you do with something you've quietly decided not to ask questions about. What nobody in the village knew, because Marlowe hadn't told a single soul, was that he wasn't just some city grandson playing at farming. He'd spent 6 years working as a hydrogeologist, testing groundwater across the driest, most desperate counties in the South. He'd watched dairy farms collapse because their wells simply gave out. He knew, better than anyone standing at that fence line with an opinion, exactly what dying land looked like. And this pond wasn't dying. It was hiding something. It never dropped in a dry August. It never rose after a storm. It just sat there flat, cold, and still all year round. And along one stretch of the old boundary wall, the reeds refused to grow, no matter how thick they choked in everywhere else. Marlowe had noticed that the very first afternoon he walked the land with the solicitor. He hadn't said a word about it since. So while the village laughed, he hired a pump, ran a hose to the drainage ditch, and started draining 2 acres of water that had sat untouched since before he was born. The first 2 days, cars slowed down on the lane just so people could stare over the hedge at the mad grandson. By day 3, the smell hit, thick, sulfurous, decades of buried silt meeting open air for the first time in living memory. And the traffic stopped altogether. Marlowe didn't mind the smell. What he minded was the waiting, because deep down he already suspected what he was about to find. His grandfather Walter had been the kind of man who buried problems instead of solving them. 3 tarpaulins held the barn roof together. The tractor shed hadn't seen paint since before Marlowe was born, and tucked inside an old biscuit tin, hidden behind decades of seed catalogs and parish newsletters, Marlowe had found the one thing Walter had kept quietest of all, a hand-drawn estate survey from 1954, with 2 faded pencil words marked right along that same stretch of wall where the reeds wouldn't grow. Springhead. He'd shown that to no one. Not yet. By the 6th evening, the pump had finished its work. What used to be 2 acres of standing water had shrunk down to a black, glistening basin no bigger than a farmyard, ringed with cracked clay and the skeleton of an old fence line the pond had swallowed generations ago. Marlowe switched off the engine and walked the edge in his waders, watching thin curls of steam rise off the exposed mud in the cooling evening air. That's when he saw it. Not treasure. Not bones. Not the buried cart the old men at the shop had joked about over their pints for years. Water, bubbling up slow and steady from a crack in the clay, right along that same bare strip of wall. Clear, ice-cold, rising fast enough that already, even as he knelt there, it was creeping back and around his boots. He'd seen spring surface like this before on other men's land, during other droughts. He knew exactly what he was looking at. This wasn't rain. This wasn't runoff. This was a live aquifer, sealed shut for 70 years, and it had just opened up under a farm nobody wanted, in a village that had laughed him out of the shop just 6 days earlier. What Marlowe didn't know yet was how fast word travels in a place this small, or how many of the same men who'd mocked him were about to come knocking, hats in hand, asking for a share of what he'd found. That's exactly where we pick things up in part 2. So if you don't want to miss what happens when a whole village finds out what's really underneath the Black Eye, make sure you're subscribed. Trust me, it gets a lot bigger from here. Marlowe didn't sleep that night. He sat out on his grandfather's back step with a torch and a notebook, doing rough sums on flow rate, elevation, and how far a man could run a gravity-fed line before the pressure gave out. By the time the sky went gray over the hedgerow, he had the outline of something that had nothing to do with fixing a pond, and everything to do with saving a farm he'd almost sold sight unseen. He rang the county water authority first, then a geologist he'd trained under years earlier, a woman who'd spent a career mapping chalk aquifers under the driest parts of South. It took 12 days and a string of tests, but the answer came back exactly the way Marlowe had suspected it would. A genuine artesian spring, self-pressurized, fed from a deep chalk seam running under 3 neighboring farms besides his own. Reliable in a way boreholes weren't. The kind of water that didn't care whether the sky opened up or stayed dry for a year straight. And that year it was staying dry. Badly. The whole region was 3 months into the worst drought anyone under 70 could remember. Reservoirs were down to mud-cracked basins on the evening news. Farmers' 2 parishes over were trucking in water at prices that made grown men go quiet at the market. Herds were being sold off not because anyone wanted to sell them, but because there was nothing left to give them to drink. Word travels fast in a village that small, and it didn't take long before it reached the corner shop. Ray Doggett was the first one back at the fence line, standing there with his cap pushed back, staring at water, so clear you could count the pebbles resting on the bottom. He didn't say anything about eels this time. Well, he finally managed. "I'll be." Marlowe didn't gloat. That wasn't in him. But over the following weeks, the visits kept coming. Neighbors asking quietly about running a pipe off his land, the parish clerk turning up with a reporter from the county paper, and a land valuer who whistled low under his breath when he saw the flow readings, then revised the value of the farm upward by a figure that made Marlowe sit down hard at his grandfather's kitchen table. The land nobody in his family had wanted. The pond everyone had laughed at. It turned out to be sitting on the most valuable thing in the entire district, at the exact moment the entire district needed it most. He could have sold it. Plenty of men in his position would have, and nobody would have blamed him for it. Not after years of trucked-in water and dying herds. Farmers would have paid almost anything for a guaranteed source. Marlowe thought about it for exactly one evening. Then he did something that surprised even the people who'd known his grandfather for 40 years. He called a meeting in the village hall and laid out plainly 3 neighboring farms, plus his own, would share the spring under a fair use agreement drawn up with the council's help, splitting the cost of the pipe work so that 4 struggling farms could get to the drought together, instead of one man profiting off everybody else's desperation. Ray Doggett was the first to put his name down. The day the shared line finally went live, and clean water ran to the Doggett farm for the first time without a tanker involved, Ray stood at the fence with his cap in his hands. "Your grandfather would have laughed himself sick seeing you drain that old pond," he said. "But I don't reckon he'd have laughed at what you did with it." Marlowe just shrugged, already thinking about the next stretch of fence that needed mending. He'd come back to Hartwell Coombe expecting to sell 62 acres of bad inheritance and disappear again within a month. Instead, he'd found the one thing the entire drought-starved district was desperate for, sitting quiet and overlooked under 2 acres of water nobody had thought twice about in 40 years. The pond filled back in naturally over the following season, spring-fed now instead of stagnant, clear enough to see straight to the bottom. Marlowe stocked it with trout the following spring, and some evenings he still walks out to that same stretch of wall where the reeds never grew, and thinks about how close he came to selling the place without ever setting foot on it, the way half his cousins told him to. Some things stay quiet for exactly as long as it takes for one person to finally listen. If you've ever underestimated a piece of land or watched someone's patience turn into something an entire village still talks about, tell us in the comments below. And if this story pulled you in, stay close. There are more like it waiting.